in hopes that now by passing the variable called name to the function called print, it will in fact go about printing the contents of that variable, that is its so-called value. All right, let's go ahead and do this here. Python of hello.py, enter. What's your name? David. And now, crossing my fingers still, I see hello, comma, David. All right, so it's not the best program. I'm kind of cutting some corners here, so to speak. I'm saying hello, David, on 2 separate lines. So it's not as elegant, it's not as pretty, it's not as grammatically appropriate in English as just saying it all in one breath on one line, but at least I've solved the problem. Just not very well yet. But let me take a well, let me come back to the code here in question and see if we can show you just a couple of other ways to solve the same problem, along the way emphasizing that what we're technically talking about here, yes, are strings, but there's even a technical term for these strings. In Python, it's just str. You know, if you programmed in other languages, people who invent programming languages like to be very succinct to the point, so we tend to use fairly short phrases to describe things, not necessarily full words. So while you might say prove this in one other way, I like the progress we've made by keeping everything on the same line. Hello, comma, David. All on the same line. What more, though, could we do in terms of solving this problem? Well, it turns out that we didn't have to give up entirely with using print twice. Let me rewind a little bit and go back to that earlier version where I wasn't really sure how to solve this problem. So I was using print once to print out just the hello and the space and the comma. And then I used print again to print name. That, strictly speaking, wasn't bad, but there was this visual side effect that I just didn't like. It just looked ugly to have these 2 lines of text separate from one another. But there's another way to fix this. Clearly, it seems to be the case that the print function is automatically outputting a blank line. It's moving the cursor automatically for me to the next line, because that's why I'm seeing hello on one line and David on the next, and then my prompt, the $sign, cursor to the next line, argue. Turns function on a fish URL here, and the document for the from that yet. Learning a programming language is honestly learn to read the documentation, because truly all of the answers to your questions will some way be there, even though admittedly it's not always obvious. And I will say too, Python's documentation isn't necessarily the easiest thing, especially for a first time or a novice programmer. It too just takes practice, so try not to get overwhelmed if you're not sure what you're looking at. But let me walk you through this example. This, again, is a line of text from Python's official documentation for the print function. What this indicates as follows is this. The name of this function is, of course, print. Then there's a parenthesis over here and another closed parenthesis way over there. Everything inside of those parentheses are the arguments, the potential arguments to the function. However, when we're looking at these arguments in the documentation like this, there's technically a different term that we would use. These are technically the parameters to the function. So when you're talking about what you can pass to a function and what those inputs are called, those are parameters. When you actually use the function and pass in values inside of those parentheses, those inputs, those values are arguments. So we're talking about the exact same thing. Parameters and arguments are effectively the same thing, but the terms you use from looking at the problem from different directions when we're looking at what the function can take versus what you're actually passing into the function. So what does this imply? Well, this syntax is pretty cryptic, but at the moment, just know that an asterisk, a star, and then the word objects means that the print function can take any number of objects. You can pass in 0 strings of text, 1 string like I did, 2 strings like I did, or technically infinite. It's, of course, stored in that file, hello.py. What we'll soon see, though, is if you find yourself as the programmer solving a problem the same way again and again and again, technically in Python, what we're really specific documentation for the print. Let's focus, though, for a moment on this. The print function takes another parameter called end, and the default value of that parameter is apparently, based on this equal sign and these quotes, \n. And what is \n, if you'd like to chime in the chat? Anyone who's programmed before has probably seen this, though if you've never programmed before, this might look quite cryptic. \n means new line, and it's a way textually of indicating if and when you want the computer effectively to move the cursor to the next line, create a new line of text. And so technically, if we read into the documentation, we'll see more detail on this. The fact that there's a parameter called end in the documentation for the print function just means that by default, this print function is going to end every line later. Well, with two, in fact, single space. By default, when you pass arguments to print, my space, because it's between them, extra. At that space function, recall that they magically had a space between them. In fact, they had to the print function, recall that they magically had a space between them. In fact, they had that space plus my own space, and that's why I deleted my space, because at that point it was extra. So this just means that when you pass multiple arguments to print, by default they're going to be separated by a single space. By default, when you pass arguments to print, it's the whole thing is going to be ended with a new line. Now, just by knowing this, and let me literally wave my hand at the rest of the end, I don't like how we can't leverage this now to solve that original problem. Well, that's happening again because print is automatically printing out a new line. So let's tell it not to do that. Let's tell it by passing a second argument to the first use of print to say end equals quote unquote, unquote, nothing there. And I'm going to run, is going to stay on the same, is going to print out hello, comma, second line, next line, because if you do something cryptic like, well, I have no idea what's going on, let me just put in temporarily 3 question marks here, we'll see the David and hello, and then use straight just function of this by a worked. Of being question mark, just to wrap our AVID enter are now separated in an ugly way by 3 question marks. Because I've overridden the default behavior of SEP. And even though the documentation uses single quotes, I've been in the habit of using double quotes. In Python, always use double questions. Now, official name, positional to print, aimed for the lines them in at the end.
This may be a weird question, but I was wondering, marks.
Corner case, right? Just if you want to print this, maybe I'm own, well, in finger quote, you'll see that this is just invalid syntax. Are misleading early, I can change my outermost quotes as long as you're consistent, and you'll see them literally friend. But there's another way. If you insist on using double slash n to character and escape multiple characters, quotes, so they're literal quotes. So now let me go back as well. Let me code specifying we have yet enough because I want to get back to the point ultimately of specifying now a final way, which is perhaps elegant when it comes to use a relatively new feature, variable like that in your string, because we already saw this is if I put very subtly changing the not done yet, Python, but I need to tell Python that this is a special string. This is what we're going to call a format string. Tells via which you beginning of the Python that, ooh, this is Python hello.py enter, DAV. We don't start with this way because I think if we did this, another things we can operations here, we're going to actually type in mods. You hitting the so big. It's our def probably be for you, maybe in a formal, nice way necessarily with strings, zone document, how to function it with something. Hopefully, what might happen if a user doesn't cooperate. If I go ahead here and run Python times, why or a couple more times, it's got spaces here, prioritizing aesthetics and grammar. Like, why are there so many spaces after the comma? This is not a very nice way to greet your users. But we can clean this up. It turns out that built into strings, which again is this data type, so to speak, this type of data in Python, is the ability to actually do things to that string. So let me do this. I can actually go ahead and do something like this. Name equals name.strip. And what does this do? Remove white space from string. And what do I mean by this? Well, on the period, function, and that's a text called aka strip, like open parenthesis and arguments. But that's going to use the means assignment. Turns to me, space to the left, I'm going to copy that value inside of my name value of variables by just using the assignment operator, the equal sign again and again and again. And it will just keep copying from right to left, hello.py, space, DAVID in all lowercase, space, enter. It D isn't all code. Try this. It turns out that so let me go ahead and way to right now going on DA. How do something? I'm getting a little curious here. How about this? Space, DAVID, space, Malin. I'll use my last name now. Enter. Okay, so ironically, capitalize is not really capitalizing everything we want. It's clearly capitalizing what? That come with that. I bet we'll find title. Capitalization word. And then I tired out that I just did a moment ago was I hit the up arrow. That immediately goes back through my history of all of the commands I've ever typed. Let me go ahead, all lowercase, enter. Now it's looking better. Now I've capitalized things and cleaned things up. But what about my code? Really need not bother a lot together. And with a line left of the value of the white space, space value, you want things string. Now we can finish same name variable. And you know what? I can take this even one step further. And let me just do strip and title all on that first. It's a lot neater because it's just easier to read. Fewer lines of code, fewer opportunities for mistakes. It just allows me to, if there's Any questions on these functions are?
So it's
Short answer, no. If you read it, but not others called, we're going to have to do it.
Like this dot
Question, technically, at
combine. So how many we can combine?
some point your code's going to start to look really, really bad. And again, multiple lines. A good question. Everyone's hand this now with my previous approach. In Zoom, you can use the yes icon. If you think this previous version broken out, post a lot of yeses and a lot of who's voting yes. Why do you think the current version of this code is indeed better?
more readable, and then
Yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable. It's very readable, at least if you're in the habit, as you are in English, of reading left to right. It's just reading nicely onto the screen. Who thinks?
It seems like, so I think
And even though my sentence here, what's your name, is relatively short, you could imagine that this could get even ugly longer strip, or that I am calling title. It might be kind of an unexpected surprise. So I think that's reasonable too. In short, there is no right answer sense of someone doing this, so long as that's what's important. If you're just doing things because you don't really know which one's better, that's not great. But if and when you start to acquire opinions, and if your boss, if your teacher, if you're at least have an answer, bunch of other methods into multiple first name, could actually leverage substrings. How can we split user's name into first name and something like, presumably, Dave split? Turns out splits in Python assign both last equals, and that's which value in the second something like David Malin, I can just say hello, comma, first. All right, let's go ahead and clear my terminal window, run Python of hello.py and hit enter. I won't bother with any leading white space this time, but let me go ahead and type in David space Malin, and crossing my fingers as usual, hello, David, is what we now see. All right, so we've seen so many examples thus far. Is what we made. All right, let's go ahead and clear my terminal window, run Python of hello.py and hit enter. I won't bother with any leading white space this time, but let me go ahead and type in David space Malin, and crossing my fingers as usual, hello, David, is what we string data is Python in. So just well, what two lots of symbols that we use, and we've seen plus before. Although we used it for to add, and the only doesn't mean that's after can, like many people on code and care about save. Let me go back over here and the program bracketing the interpreter human world, then back mode. Think of it, that's two. If I want there too, and we want to be on activity basic operation, just calculate the name of. So I later that does change the mathematical thing of calling my first variable x, my second variable y, and then I'm going to give myself a third variable, z equals x plus y, and then I'm going to go ahead and print out z. Now this program, admittedly, not very exciting or interesting. In fact, it's a little less interesting than printing stuff on the screen like before with strings, but we'll build on this and see what other features exist in Python that we can leverage. So hopefully Now on these examples and go back to where we left off with my code. I'm just undoing all of that because
This may be a weird question, but I was wondering, what if someone wants to like add actually quotation marks within the quotation marks?
Yeah, I like how you think. This is what we would call a corner case, right? Just when we've made, right? This is all sounding great, at least as programming goes. But wait a minute, what if you want to print a quote? That's a really good question. Well, let's see if we can't figure this out. Suppose that I want to print out not just the user's name. Let me simplify this further. Let me go ahead and get rid of a lot of this. And let me just say something like, hello. Maybe I'm being a little sarcastic here. Hello, friend. You know, in that kind of tone. Well, this is not going to work actually, because you are. And if I try to for like and change quote, you can Python if hello system back literal alt in a sense in front. Those aren't literal. Those terminal window run Python of hello.py. Enter that too. Back to where we left off. Let me so escaping is a general technique that allows us to do that. Go back to work. Go back literally in a new and other way. Just what we. Parameters. Positional quotes. Generally always use double quotes. Python's documentation, though, always uses single quotes. And it's in of SEP. And by 3 question, hello, comma, wrap our mind, we value a VID and separated by this. When I passed in hello, let me rewind outcome statement. Hello, comma, to my put in temporarily 3 question marks here. We'll see the results of this too. Let me go back down to my terminal window, run Python of hello.py. What's your name, David? And now you see literally